Welcome to the Affirming Minds Podcast, where we equip like-minded mental health professionals with a therapeutic toolkit that helps add to a more engaging, fulfilled, and effective mental health practice. Each empowering episode can stand alone as a continuing education pod course or a very valuable professional or personal resource with insightful expert interviews, practical resources, industry news, and lots of inspiration. We help the modern therapist thrive at work. Now let's welcome your host, a dedicated therapist and passionate educator, Shaina Siber, LCSW.
Welcome to the Affirming Minds Podcast. I'm your host, Shaina Siber. I'm so happy that you tuned in today. This show is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional treatment or clinical supervision. If you're in need of support, please reach out to a licensed mental health professional in your area. Whole clinical examples shared are fully de-identified, composites, or vignettes. No real client information is ever disclosed. If you're interested in earning continuing education credits for this episode, head to affirmmentalhealth.com. Our membership gives you access to CEs for live virtual workshops, self-study webinars, and eligible podcast episodes right here on the Affirming Minds podcast. Today, we're diving into a powerful conversation on holistic mental health, what it means to go beyond traditional talk therapy and bring the body, spirit, and community into the room. My guest is LeNaya Smith Crawford, the holistic therapist. She's a licensed therapist, holistic mental health educator, business mentor, international teacher, and wellness CEO. With over a decade of experience, LeNaya helps therapists, healers, and leaders reclaim their wholeness, integrate holistic practices into their work, and build aligned, sustainable businesses rooted in care and purpose. LeNaya earned her bachelor's in psychology from Spelman College and her master's in marriage and family therapy, specializing in trauma and spiritual integration. She is also an advanced certified yoga, breathwork, and meditation teacher and a sound healer. Her approach blends clinical expertise with ancestral, somatic, spiritual, and holistic healing practices. And her work has been featured in the New York Times, Essence, the Huffington Post, Healthline, and on Bravo. She's also the creator of the Holistic Therapist Academy, CEO and founder of LSC Wellness, Kaleidoscope Therapy and Holistic Wellness, and the co-founder of 7 Yoga Studio and Yoga School in Atlanta. At the heart of her work is a deep belief that we are all worthy of the time it takes to nourish our minds, bodies, and souls, and of living in our heart's deepest desires. In our conversation, we'll talk about the 5 layers of holistic healing, how yoga, breathwork, and sound healing can ethically and effectively support therapy, the neuroscience and evidence backing these approaches, and the ethical considerations every clinician should keep in mind. If you're curious about bringing more integrative, embodied care into your practice, or looking for inspiration on your own healing journey, this episode is for you. I want to take a quick moment to thank Jane for sponsoring today's episode. Jane is an all-in-one practice management software that helps therapists streamline booking, billing, and charting. You can check them out using the link in the show notes. And if you're ready to make the switch, use code AFFIRM1MO for a 1-month grace period. LeNaya, thank you so much for being here on the Affirming Minds podcast. I am so excited to get into our conversation today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited.
Yeah, so let's start by getting to know you a bit. Can you share a little about your journey into this work? What led you to become a holistic therapist?
Yes, thank you for asking. My journey to becoming a holistic therapist really started in childhood, if I could say. I'm the daughter of 2 pastors, and so I was raised with this belief that in order for us to truly heal, we had to integrate the mind, body, and spirit, and that in order for us to be truly self-actualized, we had to integrate all layers of who we were. And so this idea of having this integrative approach to healing didn't become really tangible to me until my master's program. And I think your audience is mostly master's and PhD level. We know how stressful the master's program can be. And so for me in my master's program is really where I found the practice of yoga to help me be able to alleviate stress. And it was a really good combination with everything that I was learning as a mental health professional, but also just in my overall journey. And so having this practice of yoga, again, gave me this tangible aspect particularly for the body approach to this integrative work. Yeah. And so I don't want to say few, but I'm one of the therapists who have just as much training in my clinical world as I do in this holistic and integrative world. I graduated with my master's at the same time I graduated with my yoga certification. And as I got more clinical training, I also got more training in this holistic and integrative approach. And through the journey of learning more, but also living more life, I really started to expound upon what it truly means to take this holistic and integrative approach. And so while having this mind, body, spirit foundation was really great, when life started to life, if you will, I know I needed a little bit more. And so I have gone through traumatic loss, grief, high functioning depression, and burnout. And through this particular healing journey, I realized that I was compartmentalizing a lot of who I was. I felt like my role and my work as a therapist was over here, and my healing and therapy was over here. I felt like my interest in these holistic and integrative practices were over here. I felt like my upbringing in the spiritual Christian community was over here. And I noticed that as I'm trying to put all these pieces together, I'm actually compartmentalizing who I was. And so it really wasn't until I took a fully integrative approach to my healing where I addressed the physical aspect of my healing, the energetic aspect of my healing, the mental and emotional aspect of my healing, the spiritual aspect of my healing, as well as the communal and relational aspects of my healing. That's when I really started to experience this authenticity, this joy, this freedom that up until that point, I didn't really think was possible. And so my journey to taking this holistic approach is twofold. It's one, a foundation and what I was brought up in, two, what I've learned along the way of my journey of being a therapist. And three, and I think most importantly, it really stemmed from my own healing journey, right? It wasn't until I was able to have a fuller picture of what it means to be a holistic therapist or practitioner that allowed me to really experience this healing that I'm so glad I was able to experience and embody.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting. And I just want to unpack some of those things that you said there. One, I think it's so important what you said of just garnishing that wisdom from your spiritual traditions and the way that you grew up to intuitively understand that mind, body, spirit working in concert was the path to healing. And it is so interesting and counterintuitive in a way that our healthcare system and our mental health care system is set up counter to that, we really break these into these different parts of ourselves and operate on them and intervene on them as if they are fragmented and that they're siloed. And I think that I do think it is unique that what you shared about your pathway, that your holistic practices, your body-based practices, the integration of yoga, it wasn't secondary to support the clinical training. It was just as much as of a force. So it's not, and I think a lot of people, later in this journey who've done so much talk therapy and getting to that point of, okay, this isn't sufficient. We need more somatic integration, but I'm coming in heavy with that clinical and pulling in the body base. And I think what makes your voice so important in this space is there's no hierarchy there. It's not, oh, this is a supplement to enhance. No, this is integral to the work. And yeah, I just think it's also important that we as therapists break down that us versus them. So I do appreciate you sharing that this has been such an embodied practice for you. And by living it and integrating this into your life is a lot of what has solidified this work for you.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important aspect of this work is that embodiment piece. Because as therapists, many graduate programs, we only need like a certain amount of therapy, individual therapy in order to get our master's. And I'm learning now that there are some programs where you don't even have to do your own therapy in order to graduate. And so this teaches us that we do have this hierarchical approach, right? Like we are the all-knowing therapist. We've got the clinical skills, we've got the modalities, and we're here to help and save our clients. And we put ourselves on the back burner, which in turn leads to us experiencing things like higher burnout, wanting to leave the field, feeling stuck in session, carrying or taking on our clients' energy. And so I'm a big believer that this holistic approach is not just for our clients and our communities, but it's for us as well. And that embodiment piece, integrating this into your own practice and into your own life will only make you a better practitioner and a better therapist.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for some of our listeners who may be approaching this for the first time, how would you define holistic mental health? What does the holistic approach look like in practice? How does it differ from other traditional, talk therapy models?
Yeah. So the holistic methodology that I use essentially says that our clients are made up of many layers. And so we have to address all of these layers in order for them to get to their goal of healing, right? And so in many traditional therapeutic models, we're focused in on one thing, right? We're focused in on just one aspect of our clients. And typically it's the mental and emotional. Sometimes, depending on your graduate program or your experience, you might get into the physical, right? But in this holistic approach to mental health, we say that there are 5 layers of our clients. And it's the physical. So anything concerning like the body, anything concerning the outermost layer. And that also includes nutrition, right? And then we have the energetic layer. And so this is all about our client's energy. How is the energy moving up and through the body? How is our client responding to energy? How are we responding to our client's energy? And I think that's one of the layers that often gets lost in this conversation, right? And then the next layer is the mental and emotional layer. And so this is the layer that we as therapists and clinicians, like we have this layer down packed, right? We spent years and thousands of hours of learning how to attune to our clients' thoughts and their emotions, right? And so it's really important that we understand that in this holistic approach to therapy and mental health, the processing of thoughts and emotions is still very valuable. And then the next layer is the spiritual layer. And so this is the layer that really is about the individual. Something that I often find is that there are communities of people who think that some of these practices that I know we'll expound upon later go against their religion or go against their spiritual ideologies or go against their beliefs. And I'm a big believer that we can't label what's spiritual for our clients and our community is. And so this particular layer is really about the individual. And so the spiritual layer could be anything from going to church to praying to meditating to going outside. For me, going outside and feeling the sun on my face, that's a spiritual experience, right? But it's important that aspect is integrated into our work with our clients. And then the final layer in this holistic mental health methodology is the communal layer. And so this is another layer that I think has often been forgotten, especially in the way that we work here in the West, right? We have to understand that healing also happens in community. Healing happens in relationship. And so this is the layer where we're really talking about what is your community support? What does your relationships look like? And so on and so forth. And so this is truly the model that I use and I teach from when I'm talking about this holistic approach to mental health and healing.
Yeah, that is beautiful and so important. And I will say, just in terms of maybe the parts that get unseen and or neglected in traditional models or westernized models specifically, that piece about energy, I don't think I've ever had someone on the podcast or do the training that has talked about attending to energy is a clinical intervention. But as you were saying it, I was like, oh, why is that overlooked? Why is that an omission? Because I think there is a felt sense that you walk into a room and you could feel the energy of a room. You could walk into a place and immediately feel a sense of connection or belonging or not. And even just the connection with in a therapeutic relationship, it's like a synergy. It's something that's not as easy to name explicitly. A lot of it is an energetic, I don't know, vibe for lack of a better word. So I love that as being named so explicitly and really part of your overall formulation of understanding a person well as those collective elements you are naming. It's so fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. The energetic piece is important. Like you said, energy can be felt. And just like building rapport or counter transference, these are examples of energy transfers.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, what are some of the foundational principles that should be understood when incorporating some mind body work into session? What does this look like in action when you're bringing in these energetic aspects, when you're bringing in some of those physical aspects, especially for someone who does not have the years of orienting yourself in this paradigm of how you're approaching care?
Yeah. So I think one of the main or major foundational principles of this integrative work is having a good understanding of the nervous system. And I think that's a really great place to start because the more that we learn about trauma in the nervous system, the more evidence and research that comes out, it really gives you a strong foundation in this integrative approach. Now, I must say that the nervous system is not the beginning and ending of this holistic approach. It is truly foundational. And so I think that when clinicians can have a better understanding of how the nervous system impacts our clients' mental health and well being, it gives them a really great place to start integrating some of these practices that help to regulate the nervous system and create safety within the body.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so helpful, I think, just for our listeners that need that practical, tangible beginning, because it sounds like there's so much here. There's an abundance of probably knowledge, just really embody and apply these holistic practices. But I think that can be such a meaningful starting place.
Yeah.
So cool that you have this very long tradition of integrating yoga for both your health, but also in terms of your clinical identity. Can you walk us through how you might integrate yoga or movement explicitly into a therapy session? What are some of the clinical goals that are supported by those sorts of integrations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely want to say that yoga is one of the practices, but I like to name my trifecta, if you will, which is yoga, breathwork, and sound healing. So those are the primary practices that I integrate, but also teach therapists how to ethically and confidently integrate as well. But to answer your question specifically about yoga, one, I think it's important that we know we must be within our scope of practice. Right? Bring up cues. They got to be within our scope of practice. And so when it comes to integrating a practice like yoga, it is important that you do have training in that. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to go and study for years on different yoga postures, but it is important that you have training in yoga from a mental health perspective. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more, but my training program, the Holistic Therapist Academy, gives you the skills to utilize these practices to support mental health and to make sure that you're aligning these practices with your clinical expertise. So that it's important that I talk about being within your scope of practice. So that's number one. And so one of the interesting things about these practices is that these practices have the power to evoke certain emotions and certain responses from our clients. And so it's important that you understand one, what is your client navigating? What are they dealing with? And what is the feeling that they're trying to find? So, for example, if you have a client that's experiencing anxiety, often feel disconnected, overwhelmed in their body, there's a lot of nervous energy, and the goal is to really bring the energy down, to ground them, to get them present, to get them out of their head and thinking about all the things that they're thinking about. The goal is to get them grounded. And so what postures do we know that can help elicit this feeling and this response of being grounded? And so a simple way to look at this is, what is the premise of grounding? The premise of grounding is feeling connected to earth, having your head where your feet are. And so the most simple way that we can do that is to implement poses that allow the client to have many different parts of their body being connected to the mat, to the floor, to the ground, right? And so just some postures, I'll just throw out some postures that could elicit this. Poses like child's pose, where you have the tops of the feet, the shins, the palms of the hands, the forearms all grounded and connected to earth, right? There's not a whole lot of activation that needs to be happening within the body because we want to get outside of activation, right? And get them into this space of feeling more relaxed. So child's pose is a great example of a posture that can elicit this feeling of being grounded, connected, and centered. And so that's just one example of how you can start to make the connection between yoga postures and how it supports your client and whatever they're experiencing in their mental health journey and their mental health goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you sort of preface that piece about starting with the deep understanding of the nervous system and anchoring this, how like these grounding poses, if you're thinking about sort of nervous system regulation, how vital that's going to be accessing those grounding techniques through the body in a way that feels safe and supportive. And I'm client led, and so that's really fantastic. There was a randomized controlled trial that found trauma sensitive yoga, which is a completely somatic body based intervention that's all about like invitational language, but there is no incorporation of traditional talk therapy, had equal to greater effect than what are considered the gold standard treatment interventions for PTSD, which are prolonged exposure and CPT. So both of those therapies, both cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure, rely on narrative exposure work, that there's a retelling of the traumatic event that is integral to part of the therapeutic approach. And so many people do not want to do that kind of therapy. They'll never get in the door because they do not want to talk about it and they do not want to rehash verbally in that way. So we alienate so many people off the bat. And then even if we get people in the door, then the attrition of keeping people then really, wait, I don't want to talk about that. Forget this. So I think that was such an affirming finding, again, and not just that this helped with people were more likely to finish that treatment. We can have the most fantastic intervention, psychotherapeutic intervention in the world, but if people don't want to do it, then what value does it have?
Yeah, no, I love that you brought up that study about trauma sensitive yoga specifically. So that's one of the modalities that I teach in the academy because it's such a powerful modality. And so I think it's so important when, again, we have a client, they're navigating. Many of us have experienced a client who comes in because they say, oh, it's a relationship thing, it's a self-esteem thing, it's a whatever. And then we do the work and we realize, oh my gosh, there's actually a lot of trauma there. And when you start to brush up against the trauma, a lot of times the clients then shut down, they stop coming to session, so on and so forth. But when you can have some of these things in your toolkit, you recognize that, okay, this is a great part, a great aspect or place for us to integrate a tool like trauma sensitive yoga. It's not a one size fits all situation. Trauma sensitive yoga is not the same thing as trauma informed yoga. This is how we lean into understanding the nuances of these practices and how they really impact our clients and communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you named your trifecta of yoga, breathwork, and integrating sound. And I think that I just want to go through all of them. So I think there's a lot of therapists that are really curious about breathwork. I always share I have a very profound experience of doing breathwork practice where I was blown away because I think the most accessible thing I could compare it to, which I was not expecting, was when people do plant-based medicine. I wasn't, I think, maybe minimizing in my own mind that the use of breath. I was really taken aback of what a profound experience I've had with more intensive breath work. So
Yeah.
I would just love to hear from you, as this being part of your expertise. How can breathwork be used in the therapy room to support clients, whether it be with anxiety, trauma, emotional dysregulation? What's been your experience?
Yeah. To your point, breath work is one of the most accessible tools that we have, right? As long as we're alive and we have breath and we don't need support breathing, we've got access to the breath, right? And to piggyback off of that energetic piece that we talked about earlier, breath work is actually one of the most powerful practices to attune to the energetic layer in this holistic mental health methodology. And breath work is all about moving the energy up and through the body, number one, but also number two, on a more foundational level, it helps to regulate the nervous system and get us into that ventral vagal parasympathetic response, right? And so there's a myriad of ways that we can utilize breath work. And I think it's important to note that breath work isn't just used for grounding and regulating the nervous system, but it's also used for things like energizing our clients. And so this is where understanding that breath work, yoga, sound healing, and this integrative work is not a one size fit all situation, which is why I definitely feel like training is important, right? Because a client who's navigating trauma versus a client who's navigating depression, you're not going to use the same breathwork practices. You're not even going to use some of the same yoga postures with them. And so I think it's really important to understand that. What are the symptoms and what are the types of breathwork practices that are going to speak to those specific symptoms? And so, with that being said, some of the things that breathwork can help with, to piggyback off of your point, are it can really help with trauma responses and getting our clients back into the body. A big hallmark of trauma is being disconnected from the body, right? Feeling disconnected, not safe, not supported, and all the things. And there are certain breathwork practices that can elicit this feeling of safety and get us back into the parasympathetic. But even to that, with depression, like I said before, thinking about some of the lethargy, thinking about not feeling motivated, thinking about the lack of energy. There are breathwork practices that can help lift the energy so that our clients can get back into that activation state so that we can then process and get them back into the a space of homeostasis and feeling grounded and regulated and all the things. With breathwork, I think it can be integrated in many ways. So one of the most simple ways you can integrate breathwork is by starting with a grounding breathwork practice, like especially if your client is coming in and you notice that they're feeling dysregulated, or if you're a therapist that uses polyvagal theory and they're letting you know that they're further down on that ladder, starting with a simple grounding breathwork practice could be really helpful. If they told you, listen, girl, traffic was wild, okay, I almost had a road rage moment. These are examples of just starting with a really simple grounding breathwork practice. And another simple way that you can start integrating breath work is also by closing out the session. There was a really emotionally charged session. We uncovered a lot of things. There was really heightened emotions. And instead of sending your client out the door, feeling overwhelmed, feeling all those rush of emotions, you can also close with a grounding breathwork practice to regulate them, settle them, and then send them on their way.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I think that having some intervention to close out sessions is something in my own clinical training felt like an absence. It's okay. We know we're not letting clients out the door as like a raw nerve. And how do you do that? How do you close out this very kind of sacred space we've opened up where people are exposing so many they may have been experiencing or just really being with their pain? So I like that idea of really using this as like the bookends potentially of session. And I think something that you said that I just want to reiterate is this is not a one size fits all. It's really being attuned to what this person needs and providing a breathwork practice that is going to pair with what their needs are.
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the hallmark things that I teach in my trainings is how do we align the practices with the symptoms that the individual or the couple or the family are presenting, right? Because again, not every breathwork practice you learn in a CE training, not every yoga posture you learn is going to be the right fit for this particular client and their diagnoses. And so this is where, again, I'm going to say scope of practice training is really helpful in this ethical integration.
And now a quick word about our amazing sponsor, Jane. Can we agree on something? Therapists are already doing enough. They're managing care, notes, scheduling, billing, all while holding space for everyone else. The last thing you need is a system that makes it harder. That's why I switched to Jane. It's intuitive, it's beautifully designed, and it just works. It saves me time and protects my energy. The customer support alone is worth it, but the smoother workflow, That's what made it a long-term solution for me. Use code AFFIRM1MO to get a 1-month grace period. Switch to Jane and see what it feels like to be supported by your EHR for once. Time to decide if Jane's a better fit. Big thanks to Jane for supporting this podcast. And now back to the interview. Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to hear about your sound healing. I think this is less commonly discussed in clinical circles. Can you tell us what that involves, how that can support therapeutic outcomes?
Yes, absolutely. So sound healing is based on the presence of resonance. And so what resonance essentially says is that the vibration or the frequency of one thing affects the vibration and frequency of everything around it. Or if something is vibrating at a certain frequency, something gets near it, they start to vibrate at the same frequency. So thinking about resonating with someone. When you resonate with someone, y'all are here, you're on the same page, right? You're on the same wavelength. And so it's very similar to the practice of sound healing. There are different instruments that are tied to our energy centers or the chakras. And so we have 7 foundational energy centers ranging from the base of the spine to the crown of the head. And so when you mention things like the chakras, folks start to be like, okay, girl, you're moving away from this, but in clinical based situation. But I think it's important to understand that the chakras are not just like this spiritual energetic thing. They're tied to actual biological systems in the body. And essentially what it helps us understand is why are there certain responses from a particular client or a person based off what's happening energetically. And so I'm going to just go off on a slight tangent. Recently, Pessy did a training on sound therapy and how it supports mental health and trauma. And I just wanted to take a moment to applause because Pessy is a well-known organization. And so I'm really excited to see that the mental health community is starting to catch up with the ancestors. Yeah. So anywho.
I love that. Let's give Pepsi their flowers for that. That is a beautiful thing.
Yes. And even when we talk about the power of sound, the power of music, right? Thinking about the bilateral stimulation in some of these practices that we use, think about things like music therapy. A lot of times folks like to think that the premise of sound healing is somewhat not connected to that, but we're still using the power of sound frequency and vibration. And I think it's important to understand that the instruments that we play, I'm looking off to the side. My instruments are always on my desk, but both free, right? They're also tied to musical notes, right? And so essentially, when we're engaging in the practice of sound healing, we're really activating through that energetic layer that we talked about. And on a more evidence-based scientific level, because you've got to be in that space too, sound healing also helps to regulate the nervous system, right? It also helps to get us to that parasympathetic. And sound healing affects the brain waves, right? And so when our clients are super anxious, we're in that higher brainwave state. And a lot of times when we try to implement things like meditation, what do highly anxious clients typically say? Girl, meditation doesn't work for me. Girl, my mind will not shut off. I'm still thinking about the kids and the to-do list and all the things, which is fair. Now, what sound healing does and the instruments does, it allows you to move to the slower brain waves without so much of that concentration, right? And so I highly encourage the listeners, if you have not tried a sound bath, if you've not tried any sound healing experience, get on YouTube, go to my website, and just experience it for yourself. And you'll start to understand what I mean when I say the brainwaves start to slow down.
It's so interesting what we wind up being in these sort of westernized models, like more cynical of. I think, especially with our technology, where it's all of this is happening through like frequencies and waves. I understand like how my messaging gets across the world in 2 seconds. I don't understand any of that, but we accept that without any sort of resistance in our day-to-day lives. But when something where there has been this ancestral practice that has moved through time and generations, there's this balking out of it or distancing it from something that has valid scientific value.
Yes. And yeah, y'all, we're integrating with frequency all the time. Ultrasounds, things that the doctors use. Like, how do you think these pictures come to be? It's the frequency.
Right.
Vibration. So I love that you brought that point up. It's something that is based in science and we do utilize it in the medical field. But when it comes to what do you mean using frequency to help regulate the nervous system? What do you mean using frequency to be able to allow our clients to get in touch with their right brain? Yes. And I think that's also an important part that I want to bring out. A lot of the work that we do as clinicians is getting our clients out of the left brain, out of the thinking, out of the linear, out of the logical, out of the black and white, into the right brain or the limbic system, depending on your school of thought, getting into that emotional center, getting into the part of us that's less structured. And so sound healing also helps to bring us to that aspect because there's not a whole lot of thinking involved. There's no right or wrong way to be in a sound bath. You just have to be open and allow the instruments and the vibration and frequency to do its thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just appreciate and want to go back to where you started in setting up these foundations of what holistic mental health is and having these 5 elements, and there not being like supremacy of one over the other, like that there are these 5 important interrelated parts. Because I think even that experience you were saying, particularly with music, I think that's something we intuitively know can change our energy, can shift our mood, but we maybe like delegitimize it and then we don't pull for it when we're in distress intentionally because we're not equating it with medicine. We're not equating it with something that is healing specifically. And listen, science is so under attack right now. Like, I'm very much for protecting science, but I do think this almost supremacy of, oh, you have to prove that it fits into this testing and the way our studies are funded and structured to legitimize it. And I'm glad it is going in that way. And it's just interesting, like the process. So again, why I think your voice is so important in this space.
Thank you so much. And like you said, more and more research is backing up all the things that we're talking about today. And to your point, I think it's important that there's research, there's evidence to back it up, because especially dealing with clients who may be skeptical about this integrative approach or skeptical about some of these practices, saying, hey, actually, research says that yoga helps with this, right? Yoga helps calm the amygdala and breath work helps with regulating the nervous system and all the different things that these different studies are coming out with. To your point, I am also in favor of science, but also understanding that science is essentially just validating what African and indigenous people, communities knew long before it was demonized and now repackaged in a way that's more, I guess, digestible.
Absolutely. Would you be open to sharing a client experience you've had that illustrates how any one of these in the trifecta has really moved the needle for someone?
Absolutely. So one of the things I definitely want to say and point out is this holistic approach, this integrative approach really does help our clients get to their quote unquote goals a lot faster because we're not just leaning into one or two aspects of who they are. And so with the clinicians and therapists I've been able to train, the number one thing they say is that, man, things that used to take me years or 9, 10 months, like the clients are getting through a lot quicker. So I just want to preface and say that this work is super powerful. But the client that I was thinking about in particular, as I was sharing the story of sound healing, I'll start there. So she came in and highly anxious, right? Very anxious, has never had the opportunity to feel like there was any space between the thoughts. And so I knew that she'd be a good candidate for sound healing for sure. And of course, we built rapport. We didn't just come out the gate with this. Building rapport is also foundational to this work. And so I knew she'd be a good candidate for sound healing because she's tried the meditation. She couldn't turn her mind off. Breathwork was helpful too, but still there were points in the breathwork practices where her mind was getting in the way. And so I was like, you know what? I think you'll be a great candidate to utilize some sound. And so we integrated sound healing into a session. And after the sound part of the session, we process. And she said, LeNaya, I have never ever, and of course I've known this because we've talked about this, I've experienced what people call the space between the thoughts. This was the first time that my anxious mind wasn't taking over. This was the first time I was able to just take a second and breathe between the thoughts. And as she's processing, tears are coming down her eyes because this was an experience that she didn't think that she was quote unquote capable of experiencing because of all the work she's done with other therapists. And even up until this point with me, we hadn't gotten there. And so that is an example of how sometimes we need something extra to support our clients and what their overall goals and experiences are.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful. And I think that's so important to name that. I think more practices, like with the rise of third wave cognitive behavioral therapies and things like that, are incorporating things like mindfulness, meditation, use of breath. And a lot of people are searching for like wanting that to feel more regulated. And if that could do a lot of things, and oftentimes with practice, it could get used to a state of regulation. But for many people, myself included, mindfulness doesn't quiet the mind. It makes me in that observation state where I'm not as like fused and overwhelmed and flooded and pulled away by it. And that I got a busy, chattering, never shuts off mind. So I could really see the value for some people who are looking for actually creating space and creating a little bit more of that inner quiet. We just need more tools. We need more pathways to access, and that we're all so different in our experiences that, of course, we're going to probably need different mechanisms for healing that are actually going to feel safe and supportive to us. So that is so nice to hear that someone was able to articulate having that experience.
Yes, absolutely. Just getting over that roadblock because a lot of times our clients experience shame when they don't get to the goals as quickly as they thought they could, or there's this feeling of shame, like, why haven't I gotten better yet? And like you said, when we can have more tools, when we can pull from different schools of thoughts, when we can understand that, hey, we've got to make sure we're addressing all layers of our clients, it makes us feel more confident as therapists, but it also really helps our clients being able to say, hey, I got another tool for you.
You were very mindful before you launched into the incredible work you do, the sort of giving that caveat of scope of practice and our licensure. So maybe we can just speak about those scope of practice issues more explicitly. How are you navigating that, folks, especially because you do so much training and you're leading other clinicians in this space? How do you talk people through ethical boundaries when integrating holistic methods into psychotherapy?
Absolutely. So, one of the first things that I think is important for us to understand in this ethical integration piece is that these practices are here to support the client in their mental health journey. These practices can be used for a bunch of different things, but that's not why you're using it. So first thing is how we're understanding that these practices are complementing the client in their mental health journey. It's a complement, it's an integration. We're not using breathwork and sound healing to help cast out demons or whatever. I'm being dramatic, but we're using them to help with the mental health goal of the client. So that's number one. And then number two, it's understanding that the ethics boards want you to be within your scope of practice, meaning you have training on the thing that you're integrating, right? And so it's not enough to listen to this podcast, right? I mean, go and try to integrate some of these practices. It's really important that you get training in these different modalities. And so, one of the reasons why I created the Holistic Therapist Academy is because you can get training in all these different modalities, but a lot of times it's not led by a licensed therapist who understands the nuances of diagnoses and the ethical considerations and what really is within the scope of practice of a mental health clinician versus other practices or practitioners and fields and things like that. So I think those are two of the main things. What is your training, right? And understanding scope, but also understanding that these things are here to support the client in their mental health journey, not to do all the other things that you could potentially do with some of these practices.
Yeah. No, it's interesting you say that because I know I was sharing a little bit about I had a very profound experience of being led through a breathwork exercise, and it was just so much more than I ever could have imagined in terms of my experience. But It was not in the context of therapy. It was not therapist-led. And it was sort of part of a larger program, women empowerment, that sort of thing. And some of the people that did the breath work, I wasn't their therapist, or this is just my observation because you can't extract my therapist's brain, was that they were getting flooded, that they were really outside of the window of tolerance and doing this breath work. And for me, it was a very cool experience. It was very interesting. It felt energetically, spiritually, it felt very expansive for me. For other people, overwhelmed, push them into more dysregulation. And it was that moment of, wow, like this could go a lot of ways. So that to me really resonates of why that piece is so critical.
Yes. And this is one of the reasons why I say we as therapists, like we really are designed to make some really great practitioners because we understand that things do come up in breath work and yoga and sound healing, meditation, energy practices, and so on and so forth. And so when you have your clinical background, you're able to say, okay, this person is outside of their window of tolerance. How do I get them back to regulation? Or because I know this particular client or our community members are experiencing this certain thing, I'm not going to do this particular practice because I know it could cause more harm than good.
Yeah.
There's so many times I'm leading something where someone will come up to me, if I can just give a quick story.
Yeah, of course.
So one of the examples that's coming to the forefront is I was leading a sound bath session at a retreat and doing my thing, so on and so forth. A woman came up to me and she essentially said, I was recalling memories that I don't remember, but it felt so real. And not to get into too much detail, but these were memories of a traumatic experience that happened to her in childhood. I said, listen, I think that this would be a really great point in your healing journey to seek out a therapist who specializes in trauma. Now, imagine if I wasn't a therapist and I didn't have any understanding of trauma. I could have chalked it up to something happened in your past life or whatever kind of spiritual jargon that a lot of times comes up in these practices. And so I think it's so powerful when we, as therapists and clinicians who have this understanding of mental health, behavior, and trauma, can be leading these practices so that we don't do more harm than good, because harm can happen when we don't have this clinical lens in these practices.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's just such an important example of just like the way we're going to interpret and frame something is going to be different than other practitioners doing that work. So just us being at the helm of some of this and being able to have a voice to help people in their mental health and overall health journeys, I think is really important. Okay, wonderful. For clinicians who are working within systems or agencies, let's say, and again, I think that's an important note. We're going to link everything in the show notes. And I think doing more training in this is critical. But let's say you're all in. Someone is listening here and they're like, I'm sold. I'm leaning in. I'm going to do all the things. I'm going to do all the training. And I work in a community mental health practice, or I'm very new in a group practice. Do you ever find a tension if you're working within systems or agencies that might have different structures, that might have more of these typical westernized lenses for psychotherapy practices? Anything you might suggest in people who are trying to explore this and when maybe they don't have full autonomy of their clinical practice?
Yeah, yeah. And there's definitely so tension for sure. If you've ever been in the therapist Facebook group, some of the folks come for each other.
Yeah. It can be vicious. I was like, well,
Right. So yes, there definitely, I understand that the tension. So I would say, right, especially if you're working under someone and their ideals or the way they work don't align with the way that you want to work. And you have to stay there, right? Because we have to survive, we have to live, we have to do the things. I would just see if you could present some of the research, right? Especially knowing who your clients are. So let's say, I'm just going to use trauma as an example. A big part of your caseload are folks who've experienced trauma or navigating trauma. Now we can bring some of the research that says, hey, actually, these are some of the best practices that we can integrate when working with clients who've experienced trauma. I think bringing some of that research to back up the reasons why you want to take that approach, I think will be really helpful, because in this Western society, research speaks volumes. And so what does the research say? What is the evidence? What are the different things that can support your work? And that's where I'd go, right? Because at the end of the day, I don't want you losing your job if you need the job. But to also piggyback off of that, finding agencies and group practices and organizations that align with your values is going to be imperative, right? And so making sure that you can find places that come from a similar school of thought or have some of this understanding, I think is going to be really important. And, right, thirdly, when on the journey of learning about these practices and taking trainings and things like that, understanding that you can do some community work outside of the agency and outside of the group practice. One of the things that we lean into in the trainings that I offer is how can you take these practices outside of the therapy room as well? Because similar to your point earlier on, some people may never step foot into a therapy office or agency, but they will come to a community breathwork class or they will come to a community trauma sensitive yoga. So these are just some of the ways that folks can start to navigate that tension that may arise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you were saying before is linking back the intervention, whether it's sound healing, whether it's breath work, whether it's movement, yoga, other somatic practices to the therapeutic goals. And I run into this tension all the time, again, doing more of these third wave cognitive behavioral therapies and contextual practices that are intentionally less pathologizing and more about overall well-being and living a purposeful, meaningful life of values and less about symptom reduction explicitly. But I think that's the paradox. We sometimes have to like shift and meld different conceptualizations. And it's something I love about integrative practice. And it sounds like holistic practice is a lot of this is taking a lot of ways at looking at health and well-being and instead of separating them, integrating them. So I think just that piece of getting the evidence-based to get maybe the support if that's needed, but then also you being able to discuss the clinical decision making. So if we have to get through an audit or justify the medical necessity of a treatment, we have really thought it through from that clinical perspective.
Absolutely. Yes. 100% agree with everything you said.
So I'm just very passionate about burnout. A lot of the work I'm doing is about burnout recovery. What advice might you give to therapists who are feeling burnt out or disconnected from their work and are curious about becoming more holistic in their approach? And I say this really in that you're offering that so much of this was about embodied practice for you. So I'm curious, like, what your thoughts of how this could maybe be leveraged in terms of attending to burnout.
Yeah. So again, a big aspect of being a holistic therapist is that embodiment piece. And how can we utilize these practices for ourselves? So that's like the first part. Again, many of us have been taught that we put ourselves on the back burner and we do what we need to do to show up for our clients and our communities. But that's only sustainable for so long. And so it's important that we understand that we have to do our work in conjunction with helping our clients do their work. And so I think that's like the first step. How can you do your own work? How can you find practices that help to have you feel grounded, have you feel safe, have you feel access joy and all of these different things? So that's number one. And I often say we have to honor the human behind the healer, right? We have to remember that we're not Superman, we're not Superwoman. Yes, a lot of us were called to this field to be in our purpose and to help, but not sacrificing our well-being, which has been the culture and in our practice, right? And so I would encourage therapists to think about how can you do your work and take this holistic approach to yourself, right? It's not just bubble baths and candles and massages, right? Which is still very linear, but how can we make sure we're integrating all layers of ourselves in our own healing journey so we can show up more fully for our clients? And then the second piece is working authentically. One of the beautiful things about this holistic and integrative approach to therapy is we're working in a space that's authentic. We understand that pulling from these different schools of thought and these different tools really feels authentic. And so a lot of times, if we're in a space where we want to draw from these practices and integrate them, but we're scared, or we don't have the training yet, or we're in an organization that says, girl, no, then we're trying to work in a way that's counterintuitive to the way that we feel like we can show up. And that also causes burnout too. So I think it's twofold. How can you work more authentically, but also how can you honor the human behind the healer?
Yeah, that's beautiful and really helpful. Okay, so how do you assess clinical readiness and appropriateness for incorporating these modalities, especially with clients who may have complex trauma histories or dissociative tendencies? Is there anything that you are considering that makes someone a really good candidate to start exploring this work?
Yeah. So first things first, we're building rapport. Okay.
Okay.
I always tell my students, like, we're not jumping out the gate. Just because something was powerful for you doesn't mean you automatically come out the gate with these practices. So we have to build rapport, number one. And we have to have a good understanding of where our clients are clinically. What do they come in to see us for? What is the prognosis? What is the treatment plan? Right? Where do we want to take this client? And so once we've gathered enough information as to where the client wants to go, we've got them back. I'm also an MFT. So have we explored childhood? Have we explored the different, how they experience whatever they're going through within a system, right? Then once we've gathered that information, then I think it's appropriate to then assess whether or not the client is ready for this particular approach. I was actually just doing a consultation before joining, and one of the women that I was doing a consultation with was talking about a particular client who, like, emotions wrong, emotions bad, and very much so in her thinking mind. And it ties back to her connection, her relationship with her mom, and some of the things that her mom exposed her to, talked her through, did around food and body, and so on and so forth. And so this particular therapist had done a lot of work around childhood, the connection with mom, how it impacts this person's relationship with other women, and how emotions seem to be this roadblock, and has tried some of these somatic practices. And so, because she's done all this work and the roadblock is still the emotion piece, like her not being able to get tied to her emotions or connected to her emotions, even though body image and things like that are also a part of the journey, we're not going to integrate yoga because yoga could still be a trigger, even though it could help with some of the things she's navigating. We know that the major roadblock here is the emotions, right? Feeling disconnected from the right brain. And so this particular client would be a good candidate for something like sound healing first, right? Maybe a little breath work and not necessarily a movement practice, because we've gathered all of this clinical information and we understand what is the actual roadblock right here. Not what we see the roadblock 2, 3, 4, 5 sessions from now, but what is the client currently presenting? And so this is just an example of kind of assessing clinical readiness. You got to build rapport. You have to have a good understanding of where your client is clinically, and you've got to say, what is the roadblock at hand before we get to the next step in the treatment process.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful of just dealing with one roadblock at a time and opening things up. And I think a lot of within the medical model, there's such an urgency of someone who's like deeply suffering. Like, all right, we have 12 sessions to get this done. And it can feel so not conducive to healing. And it sounds like for this approach is a lot of letting things unfold and organically like seeing like what in this like more collaborative process, like what's the next step forward? What's the next step forward? And I think it's just like a different shift of healing in a non-pathology model where it's like a practice, it's a lifelong practice that there's not like necessarily a same start or end date. I am healed and that is like a part of ongoing growth and actualization, as you were mentioning, versus these maybe more rigid start stop. And that's why I think like the piece we were talking about, the evidence base, is when you have to put these more holistic models into a randomized control study where they will have to adapt it to a 12-week group of trauma sensitive shukla. It's interesting, but I think even there's also limitations in the evidence fully telling the story. So some of it is also speaking with practitioners that are doing this work, seeing the transformation in clients, and also getting the evidence from personal transformation. Do people who are receiving this care are they affected by it in a positive way? Is it moving them into more of the life that they want to live? Is it enhancing their well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking to your point of being within like a 12 session situation, it's also assessing, has there been any reduction in the client's symptoms? Maybe a client isn't ready to present to a large group of people, or they're not maybe ready to have that tough conversation with a family member, but there has been a reduction in symptoms. And so they're better able to kind of name what's happening in their body, assess whether or not they're feeling regulated, and so on and so forth. And I think that's also a win, right? A reduction in symptoms. Maybe we didn't get the whole way through, but I think that's also an important aspect to lean into as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think the future of mental health care looks like if more therapists are embracing this truly holistic framework?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think one, we'll see clients get to their goals a lot faster and realize that we can't just heal the mind and emotions. We've got to heal the body, the energy, and all the things that we talked about in that approach. But also, too, a therapist will be less likely to leave the field because we have tools that not only help our clients and communities heal, but we also have tools that help us stay grounded as well. And I also think, too, that it'll help expound the idea of what it means to heal in a mental health capacity. And so leaning more into also kind of community care, right? And understanding that healing doesn't just happen within four walls, but it can happen outside of the four walls as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm at this cross point, as I think everybody else is, about having a lot of curiosity of how artificial intelligence is going to transform our field over the next decade or so. And I think these are the things of, like, when we talk about protecting our field and retaining our field, like, we have to lean into our humanity, we have to lean into our energy, we have to lean into our community. The things that make us truly human are the things that are not replaceable with advancing technology. So I think could never been a better time to really consider the importance of such frameworks.
Yes, and thank you for saying that, because yes, with it, they can give you a CBT model, right? They can reflect back, but can they like attune, right? Can they draw on different practices? Can they lean into that humanity piece that's still very important in the healing journey? And I like to say AI will not replace us, but AI will replace all of it.
Yeah, I could talk to you all day, so I want to respect your time, but where can listeners connect with you, learn more about your work, about the training that you're offering, if they want to go deeper into this, share all of it.
Yeah, so I love this conversation. Thank you so much for having me again. But they can visit me on my website, LeNayaSmithCrawford.com, and you'll be able to learn more about the different trainings that I offer, the different retreats, the different ways that I hold space for therapists and clinicians. You can also follow me on all social media platforms at LeNaya S. Crawford. And so these are ways that you can stay connected. Send me a DM, send me an email, join my newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter with different tips and tricks and different things that we're offering. So these are ways that you can stay connected with me.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining our community on the Affirming Minds podcast. If you loved this episode as much as we did, please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and share it on your socials. If you want more information about how this podcast can add to your continuing education credits, visit affirmmentalhealth.com. And remember, let's affirm, heal, and grow together.